ancient Greece. You picture philosophers in togas debating the meaning of life, right?
Yeah.
But what if I told you this era also gave birth to a surprisingly scientific approach to medicine?
It's a fascinating paradox, really.
Yeah.
We often associate ancient Greece with these grand philosophical theories.
Right.
But the Hippocratic corpus, this collection of medical texts we're diving into, it reveals this dynamic tension between those big ideas and the practical realities of healing sick people.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's like they were grappling with the same questions we're still asking today, right? Like, how much can we understand about the world just through thinking about it versus actually getting our hands dirty, looking at the evidence?
Absolutely. That tension is at the heart of one of the most interesting works in the corpus, Ancient Medicine.
Okay, so this isn't just like some old medical textbook, right?
Not at all. In Ancient Medicine, the author, and we're not even sure if it is Hippocrates, but the author directly challenges the most popular philosophical approach to medicine.
You mean that whole idea that you could explain every illness using those big abstract concepts like hot and cold, wet and dry?
Exactly. The author of Ancient Medicine really pushes back against that approach. They argued that to really understand medicine, you have to be meticulous in your observation.
Okay.
You have to pay attention to individual patients, what their symptoms are, even their diets.
Interesting.
It's all about looking for those patterns, understanding the specific things that actually lead to illness.
It's amazing how they were already advocating for, personalized medicine in a way.
It really is.
But they weren't exactly subtle about it, were they?
No, they were not. The text itself it's surprisingly funny.
Yeah.
It's witty, and it's very direct in its criticism.
Right.
There's this one line I love where the author writes that it's not enough to just learn that cheese is a bad food, if it gives you a stomachache.
Right.
You have to know why, what's going on in the body.
It's about digging deeper, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
They were passionate about getting to the root of things, not just accepting things on the surface.
And that's a lesson that's still so important for us today.
Absolutely. Think about how often you see people clinging to these grand theories, even when all the evidence is telling them, no, that's not how it works.
Yeah, or how quickly we all are to accept easy answers.
Yes, without really understanding the nuances of the situation.
It's kind of scary how much these really old debates still resonate, even now, Yeah. But it also, I don't know, it makes you realize these struggles, about how we decide what's true. That's like a fundamental human experience.
It really is. And it raises another important question. If we only focus on the nitty-gritty details, on just the observations, and we don't try to connect them to a bigger picture, do we miss the forest for the trees?
Right.
Is there a way to balance that detailed observation with a broader understanding of the systems at play?
It's like that saying, if you have data without any way to analyze it, it's just noise. It's meaningless.
It's a good way to put it.
But then on the other hand, trying to interpret data, if you already have these biases in place, that can lead you down some pretty dangerous paths as well.
Oh, absolutely. It's such a delicate balance to strike.
Right.
But what's interesting? This tension between those big theories and what we actually observe, it isn't just in ancient medicine. We see it again in a different way, in airs, waters, places.
Oh, yeah. That's the one that feels surprisingly modern in some ways.
It really does.
It's all about how geography, the climate where you live, can impact not just your physical health, but also the personality of whole groups of people.
It's a fascinating example of early preventative medicine.
Yeah.
Even if some of the specific things they say might seem a little, I don't know.
A little out there.
Yeah.
Like that whole thing about the long heads.
Oh, wait.
Where they said that some people, the reason they had these elongated skulls was because of what they were doing, their cultural practices.
Right, like binding babies' heads.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds so strange now, but when you really think about it, it shows that they were already thinking about how our environment, our lifestyle plays this huge role in shaping who we are.
Totally.
Both physically and mentally.
Physically and mentally, yeah.
And that's something we're still figuring out today, right? All the discussions about how the environment impacts our health.
Absolutely.
How cities are designed.
Yeah.
Climate change, people having to move because of the climate.
Right.
These are huge, complex issues that have these deep roots going way back. And it's just really cool to see those connections to these old texts.
It makes you wonder how much of what we think we understand about the world today is actually shaped by these really old ways of thinking, even as we're trying to challenge them and learn new things.
Right.
And it's a good question to ask yourself, how might where you live, the climate, even like the quality of the water, how is that affecting your well-being?
Huh.
It's something to think about as we keep going in this deep dive. But for now, let's switch gears a bit.
Okay.
And talk about epidemics.
Epidemics. Okay, before we jump into that, I have to say the first time I saw that title, epidemics, I thought it was going to be something completely different from what it actually is. I was picturing like widespread disease outbreaks, mass panic, the classic kind of epidemic scenario.
Right. Yeah, it's a common misconception.
Yeah.
But epidemics is something much more, intimate. And dare I say, even more fascinating because of it. It's not about those big epic stories of disease epidemics. It's more like getting a peek into the everyday life of what it was like to be a doctor back then.
Oh, interesting. So it's kind of like a doctor's notebook, like all their patient stories and stuff?
Exactly. Just imagine, we're talking about a time way before we had modern medical terms, heck, even before people were really using paper the way we think of it, and yet here we are with these incredibly detailed records of individual patients. Every little symptom written down, the whole progression of their illnesses. Yeah.
Wow. It's wild to think about them trying to figure all that out, like trying to find some sense, some pattern in people getting sick, especially without, the tools and the medical knowledge we have now. Speaking of tools, didn't they use like a special kind of medical shorthand in epidemics?
They did. It's actually pretty cool. They came up with this whole system of symbols to represent important medical concepts.
Okay, so like what kind of symbols? Give me an example.
Well, like they had this symbol, it kind of looks like a sideways S, and that meant crisis.
Crisis.
Yeah, like a turning point in how the patient was doing. That point where things could either get better or
take a turn for the worse.
Exactly. It really shows you how important it was for them to be able to like read the signs, to anticipate how things were going to go with their patients.
Wow, yeah, you can almost feel how weighty those decisions must have felt, even all these centuries later. It makes you connect with these ancient doctors and their patients so much more personally. It's different than reading some big philosophical text, that's for sure.
It really does give you that one-on-one feeling. And, some of the treatments they describe might seem really shocking now.
Yeah, I bet.
Maybe even barbaric. But it's so important to keep things in context.
Yeah.
We're talking about a time with no antibiotics, no fancy surgery. They didn't even really understand how germs or viruses worked.
True. It's a good reminder that we're always learning, always building on what those who came before us, figured out. And speaking of legacies that have lasted, I think we should talk about the oath. Even now, it's like the gold standard for medical ethics.
It's incredible, right?
Yeah.
Even with how famous it is, we still don't know for sure where it came from. Was it actually Hippocrates who wrote it? Did every doctor have to swear it? Or was it just a certain group? We might never know.
It's funny how, even without knowing who wrote it or when or where it came from, the oath still feels so powerful. The whole idea of first do no harm, that dedication to being ethical and always putting the patient first, it's something that's stood the test of time.
Absolutely. It speaks to these ethical questions that are at the core of being a doctor, questions that are just as relevant today as they were back then. But the oath isn't just about avoiding harm, It gets into other interesting stuff about how medicine worked in those days. Yeah. Like there's a part where it says not to use the knife, even on those suffering from the stone.
Wait, so Hippocratic doctors, they didn't do any surgery? What about those, what were they called, craftsmen mentioned in the text?
That's the thing. It's not that they were totally against surgery. It's more that they believed in, like, knowing your lane. The text actually says physicians should give place to those who are skilled in surgery.
So it's about knowing what you're good at and when to get someone else involved. Yeah. Knowing when it's time to call in a specialist.
Exactly. And isn't that still a really relevant idea for us today?
For sure.
Even now, when everyone's super specialized, there's still that temptation to try to do everything yourself, to be the expert on everything.
Yeah.
But the oath reminds us that sometimes the best, most ethical thing you can do is to be humble and say, you know what? This is something someone else is better at.
To know when to let someone else take the reins, it's a powerful idea.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it circles back to that core tension we keep talking about between big philosophical principles and then the reality of what it's like to be a doctor, dealing with real people with unique needs. The oath, even though it's a bit vague in places, it stresses how important it is to find that balance, to remember the huge responsibility a doctor has to their patients.
Yeah.
But, we've talked a lot about the ethical and medical parts of these texts,
Yeah.
there's another side to them we should probably mention.
It's funny, we've been, like, really digging into all these ancient medical texts, and it feels like every time we turn around, we hit these big questions, about what it all means, about just being human.
It's true.
It's not just about, like, okay, how do we cure this or that? It's about trying to understand what it means to be alive, to live in a world where everything's always changing.
Yeah. And that's where I think the way these texts are written, how they're put together, that becomes really important. They're not just these dry, boring medical manuals. They got such vivid language, these really sharp observations, and even a bit of, I don't know, personality.
Oh, totally. Like, you can tell whoever wrote ancient medicine, they were really passionate. Like, you can practically hear their voice coming through, even all these centuries later.
I know, it's kind of amazing.
Yeah.
It reminds us that these weren't just names on a page. These were actual people dealing with the same stuff we are, trying to make sense of it all. And maybe that's why we still find them so interesting, even now.
It makes you think, like, what will people in the future think about how we're trying to figure things out? What will they see when they look at the things we write, or the art we make, or even, like, our scientific discoveries? Okay, but I don't want to get too deep here.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From ancient Greek philosophy of medicine to, like, their weird medical code.
It is weird, isn't it?
So for our listeners, what would you say are the big takeaways? What can we, living in the 21st century, actually learn from these ancient texts?
That's the big question.
Right.
I think it goes back to that tension we keep bumping up against, that push and pull between just accepting what you're told and really opening your eyes, being willing to think critically.
Yeah.
The author of Ancient Medicine, they were like, hey, everyone, stop just taking these abstract theories at face value. Get out there and actually look at what's happening. Look the patient right in front of you.
So we all need to channel our inner ancient Greek doctor.
Maybe. It's about being skeptical in a good way, asking for evidence, and being open to changing your mind if new information comes up. It's about understanding that learning is a journey. It never really ends. And that even these super old texts can have something to teach us. Even now.
Especially these days, right? Where we're just bombarded with information all the time.
Exactly. It's harder than ever to tell what's real and what's not, who to trust and who not to. And honestly, that might be the biggest lesson we can take away from all this. These ancient Greeks, they were onto something. The search for knowledge, for understanding, it's timeless. It takes curiosity, it takes humility, and yeah, a little bit of healthy skepticism too.
It's about asking why. Even when, or maybe especially when, it's hard to find the answer. It's about being okay with not knowing everything, being open to where the journey takes you. And I think that's a pretty good place to wrap up our deep dive into the world of ancient Greek medicine. What do you think?
I think it's a perfect way to end it. The quest for knowledge is a journey worth taking, and who knows what we'll discover along the way.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time, everyone, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and most importantly, enjoy those aha moments, the ones that remind us why we love to learn.